All right, now we're going to talk carbon. Under natural circumstances, the carbon cycle is going to play a significant balancing role in maintaining appropriate levels of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere so that there's sufficient level of greenhouse effect to keep the Earth warm and suitable for life. And yet not too much heat from the sun becomes trapped by CO2 in the air that leads to global warming. So greenhouse effect is actually good, okay? But too much of a greenhouse effect leads to increased warming underneath that blanket of the atmosphere in the troposphere. So the following steps I'm going to talk you through explain the carbon cycle. It's how carbon changes from one form to another as it's repeatedly being exchanged between the atmosphere, between land, water, and living beings. So absorption of carbon by plants from the atmosphere. So we've got carbon dioxide up here in the atmosphere, okay, and plants absorb carbon through photosynthesis. So in the atmosphere, carbon is usually present as carbon dioxide, as CO2, as we can see up here, CO2. One of the most important greenhouse gases. Plants make food through the process of photosynthesis, so they absorb CO2 in the air, and in the presence of sunlight and water, they produce oxygen and glucose. You guys know this from bio. The glucose produced is stored and it's used by the plants in growth. So through this process, plants act as a form of carbon storage for the plants. So right here, this carbon is being stored in plants, and it serves as a means by which carbon is exchanged into a form that can be used directly by living beings. And that's where we get this part right in here. So carbon is then stored in plants. That is the base level of a food chain. Producers are the base level of a food chain. So producers store carbon, and then that carbon then gets transferred as you go up in the food chain. So the movement of carbon from plants into the animal world, that carbon is absorbed, that's absorbed by plants, is transferred to animals through feeding. As smaller animals get eaten by bigger animals, this carbon then again moves up the food chain. So that movement of carbon from living things then into the atmosphere, when plants and animals respire, glucose that's stored in the plants and the animals are broken down to release CO2, water, and energy. So here we're dealing with respiration. So this is the whole thing where this process, photosynthesis, is where plants take in CO2 and they exhale, quote unquote, exhale oxygen. And then that carbon that is stored inside those plants gets eaten by living things. And those living things then turn that carbon into energy. And when they respire, we breathe in oxygen and we exhale CO2. So this process allows CO2 to be released back into the atmosphere. Movement of carbon from living things to the land, as plants and animals die and then decay and decompose, which is this portion right here, this decomposition piece, or when animals do defecate and their waste materials decompose, the carbon found in those materials are then released back into the environment. When the decaying matter gets buried under the ground and subjected to high pressures or other physical and chemical changes for millions of years, they change into fossil fuels, which is this part down here, this compaction. So you have these decomposing animals or plants that wind up getting buried underneath sediment, millions of years go by, and you wind up getting this carbon in fossil fuels. You know, if you're talking about what exactly is coal, well, coal is buried, decayed tropical swamp material that's been buried and pressurized for millions of years. So it's that carbon that's buried and pressurized for millions of years that we're now using to generate electricity through coal-fired electricity plants. So then we then take these fossil fuels out of the ground, all right? We burn them in power plants, factories, cars, trucks, all that good stuff. It rapidly enters the atmosphere again as carbon dioxide gas. So every year, you got more than 5.5 billion tons of carbon released by burning fossil fuels. Okay? A lot of that enters the atmosphere, and most of it winds up getting dissolved into the ocean. Okay? So we take these fossil fuels over here, we then burn them through transportation. Okay? We also have deforestation that is allowing carbon to get back into the atmosphere because we're reducing the number of trees that are actually taking carbon in. And then obviously you've got some forest fires that are taking place where this carbon is being burned off directly into the atmosphere. So we have carbon dioxide re-entering the atmosphere not only through the respiration process, but also because of this burning of fossil fuels through transportation, through forest fires. Deforestation doesn't allow for that carbon to sink back into those plants. So burning fossil fuels then adds more CO2 back into the atmosphere. Now we do have cycling, so some of that CO2 will actually wind up going back down throughout the cycle, but as of right now, we're burning and adding more CO2 than can be cycled at natural rates. Let's talk about the oceans real quick. The oceans and other water bodies, they do soak up about 1/4 of the carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere. So we need to make sure we're maintaining healthy oceans in order for those oceans to be able to be a carbon sink. But this process, this uptake is really, really slow. So under normal conditions, the release of CO2 back into the atmosphere from the ocean, you're dealing with a really low rate, okay? So it's clear that the total amount of carbon in the environment does remain constant. Okay, as we saw in the TED Talk with Al Gore, the difference between Venus and Earth is Venus has most of its carbon tied up in the atmosphere. For us here on Earth, most of our carbon is actually tied up on the Earth itself. So there's no formation or demolition of carbon in this process. It only involves the movement of carbon from one form to another. So through the carbon cycle, the level of carbon in the atmosphere hopefully is kept at an optimum level. Okay, there is sufficient CO2 up there to be able to trap the sun's heat, to be able to keep the Earth livable, all right? But by burning more fossil fuels, by the release of more carbon, especially in the form of methane back into the atmosphere, we're increasing the thickness of that carbon blanket and therefore trapping a little bit more heat in the troposphere underneath that carbon blanket. Next thing we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle, so we'll get back to you in just a minute.